So we are, of course, very fortunate in this area that we have so many historic structures here. And the Moland House, of course, is just a gem of an example of what
The hidden gem.
a hidden gem.
I'll say more about
So, I mean, the people here, I'm sure, know pretty much about the history of the Moland House. It was Washington's headquarters. It was the encampment for some 11,000, Dave, troops in 1777. It was where the Marquis de Lafayette joined the colonial army. Alexander Hamilton was part of the War Council that met at the Mullen House during that time. It is only 15 minutes away from here, as I think all of you know, so I'm not telling you anything that you don't know. It was condemned in the 1990s and going to seed before it was rescued by the Warwick Historical Society. And I have not been there myself, but just looking at the website, it's really looks great. So they've done a great job with it. And we're honored to have Dave Mullen with us here, who's going to give the presentation. Dave is the president of Moland House and has served in that capacity for off and on for 7 years, you say? And prior to that time, was an educator, was a educator in the social sciences field of Central Bucks, career that spanned over 30 years, and I learned tonight that his bride, Joanne, was also an educator in the same school system, so, and they were high school sweethearts, so, an American story. So, with that, Dave, you're on.
Thanks, Joe. Can we switch places?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. Well, welcome to this evening, and obviously this will be a nice intimate little conversation here. So anytime you guys have a question, you make sure that you ask it. You can interrupt me and ask whatever you want. I wore red, white, and blue this evening, obviously, a very patriotic combination. And there's a very special reason for that, because a fellow by the name of Benjamin Franklin Fackenthal, former president of the Bucks County Historical Society, way back, made the claim, and it's been repeated on a number of occasions, that the Betsy Ross flag was first flown with the troops at the Moland House in 1777. Unfortunately, we have not been able to uncover Fackenthal's source, and every time we find another mention of that, and we trace it back, it goes back to one of two sources, and that is either Helen Gemmell, who wrote 13 Days in August, which is sort of the seminal article for the Bucks County Historical Society, for the Moland House, or Fackenthal himself. So it's we just don't know exactly where he got that information, but the interesting thing is that we know that he did not have the flag when he left Morristown. He did have it at Brandywine, and the 13 days that the Army spent at the Moland House at the crossroads of Old York and Bristol Road was the longest they were encamped in any one place between the time they left Morristown and the time they got. And it was very close to Philadelphia, so it's very possible that they could have brought the flag out and presented it to Washington at that point. But anyway, there are other places, believe me, who also make the claim. You know, the first time apparently it was seen in battle or flying with the troops was at Couch's Bridge, I believe, at the Battle of Brandywine. So anyway, the red, white, and blue. Well, welcome to the Moland House. The first slide here shows you and Stu alluded to this a little bit here. First slide here shows you what this house looked like in 1995-96. It had been neglected to the point of the fact that it was being destroyed. And that's fairly apparent here. And as we go on, you can see more evidence. Now, this is the south facade before you saw the north facade. And that is another view of the south facade. And we'll see some other photographs later on that will be sort of from this same view. Now, the house was built, and let me just I'll go on to the next one here, which, there we go. This is one of the earliest renderings we have of the house. If you can read it, I'm not sure you can. But it was painted in the late 1870s by Thomas P. Otter. And he was a relatively famous artist in the area. That's better. That's good. And it shows you as a very simple farmhouse. Now, when Mullen built the house in 1754, he built it as his country seat. Okay, it was literally a summer home for his family. We all know how bad the cities were in the 18th century, and particularly in the summertime. And so wealthy people obviously did build homes outside the urban area in order to be able to bring their families out so that they could enjoy a much healthier atmosphere. And for the next 250 years, it basically was like this. Now, this shows some sort of Victorian additions to the house, particularly the porch. Porches became very, very popular at that point, and we later found out that the porches actually did not exist at the time when Mullen built the house, and I'll try to show you, point that out to you a little bit later as we go on. So this is one of the earliest renderings, but we have some other photographs that were taken in the early 1900s, probably, of the house when it was being used as a farmhouse. Now you can see now there's another porch on it. And here is something interesting. Let me get my pointer out here. Here is something really interesting. The original fireplace is right down in here, and we would love to have demonstrations of open hearth cooking, which we actually have done. But most of the times when we light a fire in the fireplace, it smokes. Okay. So we've had a difficult time with this because the fireplace, which is over here, and you'll get to see that later, has actually been rebuilt. And the chimney only goes up to about here. And we missed that. And we had a fireplace expert come out and say, I think your chimney's too short. And I think that's the reason your column of it. So we said, okay, let's take a look. And sure enough, some people dug back into these old photographs and found, and you'll be able to see a picture in just a little bit to see that the chimney is much shorter now. Because when the fireplace was renovated at one point, the size of the firebox was reduced. And so as a result, they didn't need as high a chimney. So it's those kind of things, even though we had the best architects and the best advice and so forth at the time when the place was actually restored to its current state, that you do miss some things. You're always learning. Okay, and there we have it again. It's probably the Robbins family here, the great-grandson of, I'll come back to that. Great-grandson of this gentleman here, that's Mr. Robbins, still lives right up the street across the street from me. We live about 200 yards north of the Moland House. In my youth, I could have thrown a baseball and probably hit it, but no longer. That doesn't work anymore. So this is Mr. Robbins, Sherman Robbins, and his son used to be my neighbor. An old guy who was a wonderful mechanic, and his initials are actually carved into the fireplace lintel in the house. So we discovered that one day when the light was coming in the right way. It was kind of a funny thing. As you can see now, let me just go back a slide. You can't read it here, but I included this, frankly, because I thought maybe you would be able to, but through copying it, scanning it, and projecting it up here, you really can't. But essentially what you see is this is the list of people here who have owned the house. Until here in 1997, Warwick Township actually totally gains control of it. Down here, if you could actually read it from back there. Mrs. Campbell here, which is right in this area, is listed in the house in the 1890 Bucks County Atlas. And so you can see it's been through a number of owners and therefore a number of changes with regard to the house. So, okay, let's go back. Get Mr. Robbins here again. And another view of the house here. And so, as I said, for 250 years basically remained a farmhouse until in the 1940s. 1940s, a gentleman by the name of Russ Graves bought the house, and he turned it from an old, some might say dilapidated farmhouse into his Bucks County estate. Okay? By the time he got finished with this, now this is the auction in 1950. when he was selling it. But the reason why I included this here is because it does give you some pictures that let you see what Mr. Graves did to the house. But he bought it in the 1940s, and by the time he was finished with it, the house had 5 bedrooms and 4 bathrooms, 3 ensuite bathrooms, and 2 bedrooms shared a bathroom. So then this is 1940s, when a lot of people didn't have indoor plumbing, you know. So it was quite a place. So I'll just, you know, give you some idea here of what the house looked like. Here is the facade, the very same view that you had back at the beginning. I think the third shot that was extremely dilapidated. But, oh, you know, the place was absolutely gorgeous. And, there we go, yeah. And what he did is he took the 2 rooms that you'll see later on, and he turned them into one large living room with a single hearth. In order to do that, he had to tear out 4 corner fireplaces, 2 downstairs, 2 upstairs. He had to tear out a wall that separated the 2 rooms. Here is his kitchen. The fireplace originally and today goes from wall to wall. But he reduced it to this size here, cut off the original lintel, so he could put a door in through here to get to his new kitchen. Why wouldn't you do that? You know, it was just an old farmhouse. So the unfortunate thing is, and we make the joke that Mr. Graves had more money than we thought he should have. He just had too much, because he did extensively remodel the house, and he took a tremendous amount of the historic detail out of it in the process of doing that. But it was beautiful. It was a showplace. Now, when Warwick Township acquired the property in 1996, they didn't want to, excuse me. Let me go back. I flipped up to the Gemmels here. But what happened then when Mr. Graves, those auction brochures, when Mr. Graves sold it in the 1950s, the reason was because his business was moving up to New York. So he sold it at auction to another family. And when the matriarch of that family died, her 2 sons fought with each other for the next 20, 30 years over ownership of the house. They each had a will, and the legend is that the one son, in order to be able to get the will signed with his name on it, refused to take his mom to the hospital until she signed it. Okay, so now, if you think about what the house looked like, the problem was that then for the next 20 or so years, very little is put into the house. It was divided up into apartments, and it's very interesting to note that our former Congressman, Jim Greenwood, had an apartment in that house when he was a very young man. I believe his mom calls it his hippie stage when he was there. But it was it was rented by young people, and when Joanne and I moved into the neighborhood in 1972, it was still being rented, but it was still relatively good shape. So what happened was that in about 1986, the last family that was there was forced out because the house was declared unfit for human habitation, and it literally was condemned. They were forced out, and it sat abandoned for the next 10 years. And during those next 10 years, it was vandalized over and over again. And so it got to the point where you saw it in the first 3 slides. Okay? And when Warwick Township was finally able to acquire the ownership, they didn't want to run a museum, nor did they want the hassle of earning the money in order to be able to restore it. So they turned it over to the Historical Society. So the Warwick Township Historical Society has a management agreement with the township. We don't own it. It is owned by the township. Officially, it is a township park. However, we earn all the money that is required to maintain it. They help us by plowing snow in the wintertime, cutting down a big dangerous tree from time to time, and so on, and have been very generous in the past. When they were more flush, at one point they donated $20,000 a year over 3 years in order to be able to match a grant that we were able to get through the state of Pennsylvania. But it has been the Warwick Township Historical Society who has raised over $1.6 million in order to be able to turn the house from what it was to what you're going to see here in just a minute. And the reason why I have these people up here, Ken and Helen Gemmel, is because they were our angels. They matched a $100,000 grant right off the bat that got us started. It was the Warwick Foundation. So they were wonderful people, personal. Well, I won't say a personal friend like we went out with them, but I served with him and Helen on the Historical Commission for a number of years, and she was just a peach of a person, and so was Ken. So we owe a whole lot to them. And here it is now. So if you take a look, at the difference, and this is from the same angle as the one in the Graves brochure and the one that was back up on the top there. I'd go back to it if you want me to, so you can see the difference. Now, what I was going to tell you is that the pent roof here, when I said it didn't have porches, how did we know that? Because when the house was being reconstructed, okay, we found two beam pockets right here, where the beams came through from the inside to support the pent roof, and that was the original design of the house, therefore no porch. But obviously that had been taken off at some time and had been replaced by the porch roofs. The actual elevation here that you see has been cut down to its original colonial level elevation. It was higher, and because there was a porch that went across here, and so the soil came up to approximately this level. So there wasn't much of a step up to the porch and then into the house. But this has been excavated to get it back down to the original and to be able to put the appropriate steps in up to the area. This is the door into what we call the Council of War room. This is the door that goes into the original kitchen. Okay? Anybody have any questions? Okay. Now, a little bit about the Mullen family. They were some true characters. John Moland was provincial councillor. He was an attorney. He was educated in the Inner Temple in London and came over here by way of St. Christopher's. The Mullins seem to have some kind of a connection with the West Indies, and I'll mention that a little bit later. He came over here, and he had a couple of, well, he was well respected, actually was head of the bar, was mentioned in any one of a number of different praiseful accounts of lawyers in the city. One said that not many of them are of any account except for Mr. Moland. So he did stand out among them. And he married Catherine Hutchinson, and Catherine and he had 8 children. And here are the 8 children: John, Thomas, John, Thomas, Elizabeth, Hannah, Robert, William, Joseph, Grace. Okay? So 8 kids he had. And when you think about that, it's relatively obvious that poor Mrs. Moland was literally pregnant for most of her adult life, because John was born in 1739, Thomas in 1740, Elizabeth 1743, Hannah 1744, Robert 1746, William in 1749, Joseph in 1754. Took a little bit of a break there between 1749 and 1754, and Grace was born in 1757. John died in 1761. So if you remember, I told you the house was built in 1754. He dies in 1761, and therefore did not get all that much of an opportunity to be able to enjoy his country seat. And when he died, he left a will. And the will was quite interesting because he was a proper Englishman, educated in England. When he died, he did not leave his property to his sons, okay, which he could have. He left it to his 2 oldest daughters, actually his 3 daughters, only 3 daughters, and to his youngest son, Joseph. All right? Now, why? Well, part of the problem was that he really considered his 2 older sons, John and Tom, to be wastrels and ne'er-do-wells. And as a matter of fact, in a codicil, his will was written in 1760, and in a codicil that was written just before he died in 1761, He totally disinherits John. He leaves Tom 1 shilling. Yeah, one shilling. And then he puts some other conditions in his will, particularly for Catherine. Now, Catherine, remember, has borne him 8 children. When he dies, 6 of the 8 are still under the age of 21. Okay? And in the generosity of John Mullen's heart, he gives her the right to stay on the plantation for the rest of her life, as long as she does not remarry, and as long as she never talks to this guy again ever in her life. Now, we don't know why he was so ticked off at Tom, except there was a marriage license that was taken out in New York State right around the time that John did this. And so maybe he disapproved of the marriage. We don't know. We've never found any explanation. But we know that he did not like John and Tom as adults. Elizabeth was the star of the family. She was the one who probably cared most about her mother and tried to do as much as possible. She and Hannah both married British officers. Okay? And let's see, and Elizabeth married 2 British officers. One died, she was widowed at one point, and so she married a British officer a second time. And by the time Washington got here, these women were both living in England. They had moved to London. Elizabeth actually raised her younger son Joseph and her sister Grace. Grace, unfortunately, was never able to live on her own. She is described as being insane, but we don't know what that means in today's. We're talking about, language and how things change. So we don't know if she was challenged in one way or another, or if she truly did go insane. The 2 middle sons, Robert here and William, were apprenticed by order of John Mullen's will. So obviously Mullen had no intention of any of the men in his family following in his footsteps as a professional and earning the kind of money that Mullen did, because he was, while he was earning money, he was a very, very wealthy man, as you can see by the ability to build the house and a number of other bills and so forth that we have that talk about some of the money that John spent. So the funny thing is about these people is that as we move on a little bit later, they start to sue each other for ownership of the house and try to sell ownership and half of ownership and this, and then they, and one complains at the other one, and there were forged signatures and all kinds. I mean, we, go into the details. We'd have to be here until tomorrow morning to talk about the Mullen family in a whole lot more detail. But suffice to say that John even tried to control things from beyond the grave. I kind of think he was a little nuts. I think there was something going on there about 1760, 1761, but that's only a Mullenism. That's not, there's nothing to back that up except, just for the purpose of discussion. Okay, so the Mullen family, as I said, quite an interesting group. Now, stop and think of it while we're here, what we're really saying, because the women have married British officers. They are the owners of the property, together with Grace, who is incompetent, and Joseph, who is also a British officer. So at the point when Washington stopped here, this was a Tory household. We don't know what Catherine's attitudes were actually at the time. We've not found anything really written about that. Most of Catherine's writings that we have found. Oh, and by the way, we know that she did talk to her second son, Tom, because we have letters that were written from his house in Philadelphia. But most of Catherine's writings were to the executor of the estate begging money. Because in addition to allowing her to live on the property for the rest of her life, John Moland also gave her a very, in quotes now, wink wink, generous allowance of £14 per year. 14 pounds sterling per year to run this entire plantation. Not only that, but she also had slaves who to some extent had bypassed, the Mullen family did, and I'll show you in just a minute. It's in the inventory of his will. So they had slaves. The slaves were getting old. She couldn't sell them. They weren't really doing much. She had the responsibility for them, and apparently one of the daughter's husbands also dumped his older slaves onto this plantation so that Catherine had the responsibility of taking care of them too. So Catherine and Elizabeth were always writing to an individual who was the executor of the estate, and we'll come to that next. Now, let's see. So we're very fortunate to have the inventory of John Mullen's household at the point when he died. And it was taken by two of his neighbors, and we're very sure, really, that he died at the Moland House. One of our members really thinks that he's found his grave, but, you know, it hasn't been dug up yet. But at any rate, we do have the inventory here. And it was taken, as I said, by two of his neighbors, and it was taken on the 3rd day of April. Now, John died in January of '61, so by the time they got around to taking inventory, a couple months had passed. By taking a look at this, you can see that this was a family of wealth. Now, you can't read it all the way back there, but, you know, 3 sets of china right here, 4 decanters, a dozen wine glasses, punch bowls, knives, coffee mill, kettles, let's see, candlesticks, washing tubs, 25 different pictures. They had 13 portraits or pictures of one kind or another of the royal family. Right. They had over 50 chairs. Now, Mullen had another estate down in what is called Northern Liberties today, and so we think that maybe this is a compilation of the two houses. But there's silver, there's china, there's damask napkins, and all of the kinds of things that a gentlewoman would have in her household, and a gentleman. Do you have a question? Yeah.
Where was Will probated at?
Bucks County.
Bucks County?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
So it was probated in Bucks County, and his obituary, which we have from the Pennsylvania Gazette, says that he was buried at his country seat. Ta-da! So, you know, and this was it. So as I said, one of our friends thinks he knows where it is, but yeah, we're not sure. So a very good question is, it was owned by British, really, because the wives now are married to British officers, and by a British officer who is Mullen's youngest son. The question is, why was the estate not confiscated as many Tory estates were? And it's kind of ironic, isn't it, that George Washington chooses this Tory household in order to make it his headquarters. Well, that has nothing to do with it. I mean, they just commandeered the best house in the neighborhood when they needed a place for the general to stay. But part of it might be because of this guy. As a matter of fact, these two guys. This is John Dickinson and George Reed. They were both Mullen's students. He was their preceptor. They studied law with Mullen. And Dickinson here actually developed almost a mother-son relationship with Catherine, apparently, because she refers to him that way in her letters back and forth. He's the executor of the estate. So, as Dickinson being the executor of the estate, and she's writing back and forth begging for money to try to raise the kids and for education and all of these kinds of things and for her necessities, you know, he's the fellow that she's corresponding to. And John Dickinson, I think, is sometimes known as the penman of the Revolution. He did not sign the Declaration of Independence, apparently because, at least my information is because of his Quaker background, but this guy did. So he's a signer of the Declaration of Independence from Delaware. And so two very, very important, influential people were very, very, very close and very good friends with the Mullen family. And that could explain why Catherine was able to keep the house. We have found no documentation to suggest that directly, but, you know, we might draw the conclusion that that could be a strong possibility. Okay, now, as I say to my 5th graders when I'm teaching them when they come in for the field trips, I say, now, you know, we wouldn't have spent this kind of money on an old farmhouse if something important didn't happen here, right? And of course they'll say, yeah. I say, well, what happened here? And they'll say, George Washington. Yes, of course, George Washington. And this is the photograph I show them of George Washington. And of course they're used to seeing the guy with the powdered wig, or the white hair, and the kind of the sunken cheeks because of the false teeth, and all the kinds of things that were the later portraits. But I always try to point out to the kids that our friend George here was actually a British officer himself, and fought in the French and Indian War, and was with Braddock out around Pennsylvania. And so this is a much younger photograph of George Washington, and I tell them that it's the history. As a matter of fact, we've had other organizations who have tried to purchase George Washington days from us. I'm not sure how you would do that, but they laughingly said, "We have 13 of them. Do you want to sell us a couple so we can have George Washington at our place too?" And well, we can't really do that. But there are three guys that really make the Moland House property extremely important. Obviously, him. This young fellow here. This is Marie Joseph Paul Yves Roche Gilbert de Motier. You know his more common name? Lafayette. Marquis de Lafayette. Yeah, that's the guy. And so Gilbert de Motier here comes over, and he doesn't really join the army here at the Mullen House as some people believe, because he received his commission in Philadelphia. And Washington actually first met him in Philadelphia, but it was at the Moland House where he participated in his first council of war and his first official duties as a major general, or it might be more appropriate to say a quasi-major general, and that's kind of an interesting little story. We'll get to that in just a second. However, he and Washington became lifelong friends, literally a father-son relationship, and we believe the so-called Great Conversation that Lafayette refers to did take place in the Moland House, probably in Washington's private office, which I'll be able to show you a little bit later. And a couple interesting things about Lafayette, if you're not a Lafayette scholar, and I'm not, I just know a few things about it. He was 19 years old when he came over. He had a daughter already in France, and I believe another one on the way, I think. And he had never fired a shot in anger. He had never led troops in a battle. He had some military training because he went to military school. His father had been an officer in the French army and had been killed in battle. And so when I have my fifth graders in front of me, I say, okay, now why do you think they made Lafayette not just a general, not just an officer, a major general? Here's Washington, here are the major generals, here are the brigadier generals, here are the other officers, here are the non-commissioned officers. Why is he up there? And of course, because he was brave? He was. There were a lot of brave people. Because he was smart? He was, and he became one of Washington's best generals. And then I do this. Because he had money and influence. And so that really is the reason why Lafayette was treated so well. He was one of the wealthiest men in Europe.
He spoke English.
And he did not. No, he did not. He tried to learn English on the boat on the way over. He learned English, and he learned to read and write in English. But at the time he first came over here, he was really minimal. However, most of the young officers who were Washington's aides-de-camp were very well-educated young men, and that since French was the diplomatic language at the time, he had no difficulty really conversing with them, but he did learn. But he studied as much as he could on the boat on the way over, which he bought himself, by the way, because he couldn't take a French boat because his father-in-law asked the king not to let him leave the country. And because he was really ticked, here's this young guy, 19 years old, he's married to his daughter, he's got a daughter himself, and he's coming over here. Well, people ask me why, and again, I'm not a Lafayette scholar, but from what I've read and people have told me, first of all, he believed in the cause. He really did. And secondly, he also was looking for a reputation. His father had been an officer. He wanted to be an officer. And of course, as soon as he came over, he wanted a command. But they didn't give him one. They said, you hang around with George for a while. And so, as I said, he was more probably an honorary major general, but he did participate in the Council of War. And then the third guy that we have is, anyone know who that is? That's Casimir Pulaski. Count Pulaski, yes. And this is kind of a funny story too, because you know, over in Paris, Ben Franklin and, his name just escaped me, was handing out letters of introduction and commissions to all of these European officers that wanted to come over here. And they all wanted to be generals and they all wanted to command. And so Lafayette comes and he presents his papers to Washington at the Moland House for the first time at the Neshaminy encampment. Interesting thing, he brings the first letter Lafayette has had from his wife since he left France. Pulaski brings it. So he and Pulaski became apparently very good friends. And Washington has now had it up to his eyeballs with all of these Europeans coming over wanting to be generals. So he says, thank you very much, you come very highly recommended. He gives them a very, very nice letter, sends them right back down to Congress. So a lot of people think Pulaski was in the Council of War and spent a lot of time at the camp. No, he wasn't. But he was introduced to Washington here for the first time. And George basically sends him back down and says, you figure out what to do with this gentleman. He comes highly recommended, but I can't use him. That's in so many words. So Pulaski goes back down, and he then hooks up with the troops after they leave the Moland House on their way down to Brandywine. And some people claim that it was Pulaski actually saved Washington's life at the Battle of Brandywine. Now, you read different books about the Battle of Brandywine, they'll tell you some different things. One book that I read said that when Washington was in trouble, Pulaski, and he was an experienced cavalry general leader from Poland, had fought against the Russians mainly. And he knew what was happening, got as many men on horses as he could and created a diversionary attack, and then literally caused a halt in the festivities of the day for enough time for Washington to gather his troops and make an orderly retreat off the battlefield so as to be able to fight another day, because it was not looking good at Brandywine. We'll maybe get back into that a little bit further. So these three guys really give the Moland House, its credentials, and have allowed the Mullen House to be placed on the National Register of Historic Sites. Okay. Now, a little bit as to why Washington was here. This is a little bit of the background of the history. He had lost the Battle of New York, all right, and had been forced out, and he was out around Morristown, which is right about here, when he got word, and by the way, the British were using New York as a garrison and a place to bring their fleet in order to be able to have their forces, fairly concentrated for going out into different areas. So Ryder comes into the camp around Morristown one day and tells Washington that the British have sailed from New York, 17,000 troops. Now at that time Washington had about 8,000 to 9,000. Okay, so the British had twice as many. 17,000 troops, 250 sailing ships. We're talking about an armada here, okay? They've sailed from New York, of course, no helicopters. You can't get up in the air. We don't have any idea. Once they're over the horizon, who knows where they're going. So Washington figures, well, they might be coming up to New England, to the north, and there's a lot that was going on up in the Hudson Valley. The British were trying to split the Hudson Valley and therefore split New England off from the rest of the colony. So there was a lot going up there. He thought also there's a possibility they could be coming all the way down here, probably to Charleston, South Carolina, a very important port down south. But he surmises it's probably going to be Philadelphia. And why? Why? I say to the kids, I say, well, if you're gonna try to kill a snake, you cut his tail off. No, they scream. What do you cut off? His head. I said, now don't go home and tell your parents that Mr. Mullen is telling you to kill snakes. I said, but you got it, you got it. So where's the head of the snake? Boom, right here. Because that's the Continental Congress, and I usually go through with the kids, okay, what happened in 1776 in July, and blah, 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 and who did that, and the Congress did. So why not try to capture the capital city? So at any rate, Washington leaves, he comes down, and is on the banks of the Delaware River, now at what we call Coryell's Ferry, Lambertville, New Hope, okay? And he gets word at that point, and he's going to stay there for a while. He gets word while they're there. And by the way, the British left here about July 25th, and it's July 30th by the time he's down at the river, he gets word that the fleet has been sighted off the Delaware Capes, right, or off of New Jersey, right here off Delaware Bay. Here's Delaware Bay. So at that point, he says, okay, at least they're going south. They're not going north. So he comes down, marches down, and comes marches down Old York Road to the crossroads. Some of the troops marched right through to Philadelphia. Some stayed at the crossroads, which is the Neshaminy encampment, which is the Moland House, overnight, and then went in the next day. So he goes down, and the troops encamp along the banks of the Schuylkill River, and there Washington is awaiting the next word as to where the fleet is. And what happened was, that's where he was introduced to Lafayette, and he decides that he's going to wait there, but a day goes into a couple days, and the troops are not in a good position because they're too close to the city. There is way too much trouble for 8, 10, 11,000 men and many of their family members to get into that close to the city. So he decides, since he hasn't heard anything, he'll go back up toward the Delaware River to Coryell's Ferry and wait, because he'll still be close enough when he gets word about Philadelphia. But if the fleet's already gone down to the south, boom, he can go back up and perhaps make a move on New York again, okay? So he's on his way back out, and as a matter of fact, he's in Hatboro. He has just had dinner with his officers, and we have the receipt that he had some 27 men with him coming back out at the Crooked Billet Tavern down in Hatboro, and had just left. And at 9 o'clock in the evening, because they kept long hours, 9 o'clock in the evening, a rider comes out and says, "We've seen the fleet again." Boom. Where? Down here, okay? Down off the Capes of Delaware at Sinnapuxet. Now, where's that? That's about 50 miles south of the Delaware Bay. Now, why did it take them so long to get from here down to here? It could have been indecision. We don't know. They had very, very bad weather. Some sources claim that they were blown right past the Delaware. As I say, you know, kids, you can't turn 250 sailing ships on a dime. You have to wait for the winds and the tides and so forth. And it could be also that they got intelligence that there were a lot of fortifications up along the narrowing of the Delaware Bay here. So we don't exactly know why, but they did make the decision to come down. And so now they're off the coast of Maryland. So what does Washington do? He then takes the troops back up, and he decides that they'll stay at the Mullen House. It was almost an accident, really, because on the way back out of the city, they got lost. The quartermaster general makes a terrible mistake, and they go off toward Whitemarsh. And then they have to come back, and then they have to go north-northeast and south-southwest, and there are a couple things written about this. So by the time they got to the crossroads again, they're exhausted. You know, boom, we'll sit here. Now, the interesting thing about that campsite is that if it was a mistake or not, it's a great campsite, because the Neshaminy Creek runs right through that, if any of you have been down there, okay? And there's a grist mill that was there right across the creek, which is now a private residence. And there is another grist mill, apparently, that is now a nursery that's down off of what we call Valley Road in Warminster, very close. And when we think about it, you know, the Mullen property, I mean, they had 140 some acres, but we're talking by this time now, Washington has his 11,000 troops because other militia units have joined him since he left coming down from Morristown. They were spread all over the place. You know, they were up and down Bristol Road. The slaughter pens were over on Bristol Road. Lord Stirling's headquarters was over right around where Stover Mill is now. And Nathaniel Greene's headquarters apparently was right across the street, where they also had the whipping post, at least, you know, legend tells us that. So it was a good place. And what a lot of people don't understand is that Carr's Hill, which goes right up York Road, if you go up 263 toward Jamison, that's Carr's Hill. It's essentially sort of a geological cliff that comes down. Where the creek is the beginning of the coastal plain. Where the top of Carr's Hill is the beginning of the Piedmont. And the men used to climb that hill in order to be able to take advantage of the breezes that constantly blow up there. From the top of Carr's Hill, you can see Philadelphia on a clear day. And it, in fact, is the highest point between there and the New Jersey shore. You could go up the top of that hill and climb a tree, and you could see people coming out of Philadelphia all the way up Old York Road if you really were so inclined and you needed to. Well, you do need to do that when you're camped. You need to know who's coming. So it was a very, very good place actually for them to camp. Thought he'd be there for a couple days, and it turns out he's there for 13, August 10th through the 23rd of 10th of August to the 23rd of August. Now here are the guys that were here with him. And again, you probably can't read this, but here's General George Washington right here. Here's Major General William Alexander, also known as Lord Stirling. The joke about Lord Stirling was he claimed a Scottish barony, and it was said by Washington, I believe Washington said, that if he's not a baron, he certainly can drink like one. Okay, so that's Lord Stirling. Here's Major General Nathaniel Greene, literally Washington's right-hand man throughout the Revolution, one of his most trusted individuals. Major General Adam Stephen here. Major General, and here's Marie-Joseph Paul-Yves Roche Gilbert de Motier, the Marquis de Lafayette here. Now we go down to the Brigadier Generals. Conway Cabal, here he was, right at the Moland House. Adam Henry, okay. Okay, who's next? Muhlenberg, John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg. We've all heard of Muhlenberg College and all the things that are named after him. General Scott, Charles Scott. Up here, Mad Anthony Wayne. Mad Anthony is here. And Henry Knox, okay? And William Woodford. No, I'm sorry, Knox was over here. He's the commander of the artillery. And who did I miss over here? Wayne. Is that Wheaton? I think it is. Wheaton and Woodford. Now, it's not just the generals. Look at the rest of these guys. As Stu alluded to, Alexander Hamilton. Okay, now, a lot of these, Robert Hanson Harrison, you won't recognize, perhaps, because he was an aide-de-camp. Very well educated, and I'll show you something that he's connected with a little bit later. Okay, John Lawrence, also an extremely well-educated young man. I think he's the son of one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. William Henry Lee, father of Robert E. Lee, okay, called Light Horse Harry. Light Horse Harry Lee. He was court-martialed at his own request at the Neshaminy camp because he had been falsely accused of something he felt, and he wanted to be vindicated, and by gosh, he was. But he had to stick around for a couple of days. The court-martials, by the way, took place in the Neshaminy Warwick Church. Actually, the old one that is no longer there, that used to be up in the cemetery, from what I've recently learned. So here's Henry Lee. John Marshall, first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, a young officer there. James Monroe, future President of the United States. Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, South Carolina, signer of the Constitution. And who do we have there? Oh, and Count Pulaski. Okay, Count Pulaski's down there too. So we have a sort of a hit parade here of people who were present and were at the Moland encampment. Okay, now, this is what I wanted to tell you about Robert Hanson Harrison. This is in his hands. This is the actual, well, it's a facsimile of the minutes of the Council of War that Washington called for after 11 days. No word had come about what had happened to the Brits. Yeah, they were like lost. And the men were actually joking about the enemy's disappearing act. But, so what he calls all of his generals together, all those fellows that you saw, and the aides-de-camp were probably in the meeting at the same time, all, scribbling notes and so on. And this is actually the official copy of the minutes of that Council of War. Okay, and here it is. What Harrison does is he lists all of the generals, the same generals that you saw on the other sheet here, and then he writes out what was decided by the generals at the Council of War, and then, look at this, they all signed it. Here they are, all those names that you saw, and we were looking at it yesterday, and I think it was Stu or Fletcher said, wow, they all had great handwriting, didn't they? This little teeny one here, that's Lafayette, right there. So this is really a very, very interesting document, and I have copies in here that you really could read if you wanted to see what it was, but I'll summarize it for you. They made a mistake. They decided to go back up toward the Delaware River, perhaps move up to New York, and sent Alexander Hamilton into the Congress to tell them that. Okay, now, as Alexander Hamilton is riding into the Congress, another rider is coming out, probably passed each other on the way, may have even waved at each other, I don't know if they knew who they were or not, comes out and reports to General Washington that let's just get the right one here. Go back a little bit. Where are the British? You know, there's Pulaski again. Where are they? They're down here. For some reason, as I said, they came all the way down and all the way back up to Chesapeake Bay. Now that's like 500 miles, at least. And so it added a significant amount of time to their journey. And at the time Washington got the news on August 21st, it was, they were already in the process, apparently, of disembarking. And so when he heard that, obviously he knew that Philadelphia is the target, that they were going to land at actually they landed around Elkton, Maryland. And there's a kind of an interesting story there too. Their horses had been on board, you know, with rations of oats apparently. And they let the horses out into some of these fields, and a number of the horses committed suicide by gorging. They ate themselves to death, you know, so they were really hungry, and you don't do that with them. If anybody knows about horses, you know, you do not let them do that. So there they were. So we'll go back here, all right. And this is something I want to show you here too, just before we get on to the modern stuff. Okay, now, here's one of the things that convinced the National Historic Committee for National Register. This is an daily expense account, 1777, August 23rd, okay? And right here, this is in Washington's hand, is in his expense account. To cash paid Mrs. Moland for her furniture. £5, 5 shillings. We don't know what they did with her furniture. We don't know if they destroyed it, or if they just used it, but they paid her for her furniture, and being the ultimate gentleman, to cash paid for a woman for cleaning the kitchen. £1, 2 6, okay? Now, I've since, actually just over the last couple of days, I was reading a bunch of stuff, and I realized that Washington regularly did this. When they commandeered a house as headquarters, he paid for it, and paid it to the family. And so we have this receipt of the money that was paid to Mrs. Mullen for the use of her house. And we think that's pretty special. Now, here we are today, okay? And what I just want to tell you a little bit about, and then we'll wind up. It's already 8 o'clock. We started a little bit late, but we'll run through this very quickly. This is the kind of stuff that we have to still continue to do. It was not easy to raise the money for the restoration. It's much harder to raise money for maintenance and to pay the utility bills and to do that kind of stuff. We are a 100% charitable organization, and this is one example of a job that we had to do. This is the old bank barn wall. That literally was falling down and was becoming dangerous. It had moved several inches over the past winter before this was taken, and so as a result, we had to do that. $20,000, okay? Because that old wall had to be completely taken down and redrained and a base put in order to keep somebody from getting killed. Now remember, this is Warwick Township property. We don't own this, but we have this agreement with them that we're going to take care of it, okay?
So how did you fund that one?
How did we fund that one? We were very, very fortunate. Our former president, Warren Williams, whom you met, and I have to say something about Warren. He was president during the 8 years when most of the funding and the restoration took place. And he was a crackerjack. He was a teacher, and he was one of these teachers that kept touch with almost every one of his students. And this is one of my former students, and he would get them to do things for him. And one of them was a fellow by the name of George Porter, Fisher and Porter.
I worked for Fisher.
Okay. Warren convinced George to give us $200,000 in stock. which, you know, a lot of people say, oh my God, you're flush. You don't need money. Oh, how quickly at $17,000 to $20,000 a year going out with only $15,000, $14,000 coming in, are you going to go through that? And when you have to spend $20,000 in order to be able to do this, and so on, and we put lights in the parking lot, which I don't think I have a shot of that. That was another $20,000 job. And it goes on and on and on. So, here we are. So this is what Joanne and I decided that what we had to do is we had to make up a sign to have at all of our events to tell everybody that, hey, we'll take any donations we can get because this is not your tax dollars at work. A lot of people come in and say, oh, aren't we proud of Warwick Township? They should be, because they helped us. They got the property in the first place, but we don't get any regular financial help from them. It's all on the Historical Society. So we have this little sign that we put up. Now, one of the things that we do every year, we're basically an educational organization, and one of the things that we do every year is our reenactment. And there were some brochures back there, if you didn't get one. There are also House of Heroes brochures about the Moland House and about our nature trail. And so every year, and Joanne's the chair of this, and we do a reenactment where we put on this show for now this is some kind of a mini folk fest. Remember the folk fest up here? Yeah. And we put on this show for the local people, kids, families, and so forth. And here's our blacksmith, Bob Herman, firing up his kiln there, not his kiln, but his forge. This is one of our members. This is Murray Gaiman. He is an excellent artist, and when you come down to the Moland House, I'll show you some things that he has made for it, and it's just magnificent. All right. This is the plan of the property. Here is the house. We have a native garden up here, which is looking beautiful these days. Here is the carriage house that used to be a guest cottage and an apartment back in the days when Mr. Graves did the restoration. Here's our paddock here. Mr. Graves didn't like his horses slopping around in the mud, so he built a nice stone paddock with a concrete floor. And we still have that. And this is our handicap parking, actually, right here. This is Old York Road out here, and this is 263. Over here, here's the creek. And it's just down across the creek right here where that grist mill still stands that I told you about before. So this is basically the outline. And we have this nature trail. See? It goes all the way around. And we have different stations. And we are declared a wildlife sanctuary. So we're pretty happy about that. We have colonial toys. This is one of the things that we do with the school kids when they come in, and this is available at the reenactment for them to play with. This is the 5th Pennsylvania Regiment. They are regulars every year at the Mullen House, and they were actually there. The 5th Pennsylvania was there. The people that I showed you before were First Crossing volunteers. They bring a nice big cannon with them, so that's a lot of fun. And they demonstrate all the outdoor cooking. Oh, by the way, you can see the women here. There are about 150 documented examples of women actually fighting. And Molly Pitcher was really a kind of a name that was associated with all of these camp followers. But there were some 4,000 to 5,000 camp followers with the 11,000 troops. Many of the men were so poor, they had no homes, they were tenant farmers and so forth, so their families came with them. Now, there were also the sutlers, the people that regularly sold the liquor to Washington for his troops because the boys didn't want to go without the rum. And there were, tinners and potters and other merchants. And then there were also some shady characters. I don't mention them when I'm talking to the 5th graders when they're sitting around on the floor. You know, there are always some ladies of the evening that are around when you have that many men, and so, but there were quite a lot of women and children who followed there. This is Merlin Miskelly. She's our spinner. One of our guys makes these signs, and this is a sign that was made for Mark Carroll, who's an 18th century musician, resident musician down at City Tavern, and he comes out for the reenactment. We have puppet shows. Fred Nessner here, he's a blind man. He's been blind for most of his life. He makes the most beautiful powder horns. And he's actually written a book about blind people in Philadelphia, which, we don't want to do that, just click that off over there. Okay. And So that's Fred. Here's Cal Uselmeyer. He's the one that made the sign, and he's one of our woodworkers. We have our own colonial woodworking shop now, and they make a lot of the toys for the gift shop, which Joanne also does. So we have homemade Jacob's ladders and jumping jacks and all of those kinds of neat things. And so, from George and myself, we bid you a fond good night.
Very nice.
That's another thing we had to pay for was the lighting around. So, you know, as you can see, it's an expensive thing to maintain this property and to keep it looking beautiful.